Welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Principium Pod. I'm your guest host this week, Catherine La Rooy, and I'm the Commercial Director at Principium Strategies. You may recall from recent podcast that Dennis Proud talked about the ever-increasing trademark application volumes in China. It is in this context that we wanted to dedicate today's pod. We'll dive into specific considerations of trademark watching in China and talk through what expertise is required to protect trademarks in China. Joining me today is two of our experts in this area. I'm joined by Andrew Woode, who is one of our senior analysts at Principium Strategies with over 15 years experience in trademark watching and a knowledge of over 17 languages, many of them fluent. We're also joined by David Grossman. He is the Director of Operations at Principium Strategies, and he has over 20 years of experience working in trademark watching. He has personal knowledge of 4 languages himself and has designed the entire operation around the needs of trademark professionals and his knowledge of language and operations. With China's economic growth so strong, let's start by talking to David Grossman about the impact of that has on his trademark watching operations. David, what's the current situation in China?
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for having me on. So the current situation in China is that over the last 20 years, but specifically over the last 2 years, we're dealing with a tremendous growth in volume. So to put that into context for you, in 2016, there were 3.7 million trademark applications filed in China, most of which would have made it through to publication. In 2017, there were 5 million trademark applications, and most of that growth started after April 1st, 2017, when there were some law changes, which we'll get into shortly. And based on what our agents tell us, we can expect 8 million trademark applications in 2018. So more than doubling of the data on an existing base that was already close to the total that you could find worldwide in every jurisdiction. What this means for us is that we review weekly publications of trademarks that are officially published for opposition purposes. And whereas 2 years ago we were dealing with 50,000 weekly trademarks that needed to be reviewed, since April 1st, 2017, we've seen that number jump to over 100,000 weekly records, and we're told to expect this number to rise to 150,000 weekly records. This is a tremendous amount of data, and of course, this data comprises trademarks published in Latin characters, trademarks published in Chinese characters, and trademarks published in both Latin and Chinese characters. Of these records, 100,000 applications were published in Class 5 alone, and over 320,000 applications were published in Class 35 alone. We also know that there are over 240 applications published in Class 25 and approximately 200,000 applications published in Class 30. To put this in context, by comparison, in 2017, there was a total of 111,000 applications in the EUTM journal, 87,000 applications in France, 50,000 applications in Germany, and about 72,000 applications in the UK. So what we know is that in Class 35 alone, there are more records in China than in all those jurisdictions combined.
Thank you, David. There's some really astonishing numbers in there. What's behind this? What are the drivers that are causing these huge increases?
We think this is a result of a change in law in China that happened April 1st, 2017, and also because this is a growing economy and has been growing for over 2 decades. On April 1st, 2017, the China Trademark Office, also known as CTMO, lowered the trademark fees by about 50%. This reduction in cost pertains to application costs, renewals, assignments, change of owner names, etc. Essentially, the Chinese government was looking to stimulate growth in the IP sector. This is part of what has been called a 5-year plan, in which the Chinese government is looking to capitalize on growth and cultivate their IP assets. The risk of this, of course, is it can unwittingly promote trademark squatting and applications filed in bad faith. This potential outcome can have a significant impact for trademark owners and, of course, providers of trademark surveillance services, such as Principium Strategies.
Thanks, David. That's good to understand that background. So from your perspective, why would you encourage trademark owners to be interested in this topic?
So I think it's interesting and important for us because any individual or entity that subscribes to trademark surveillance services, also known as trademark watching services, is typically concerned about three things: receiving a service that is qualitative in terms of receiving accurate and relevant data or watch notices, timely notices so that reports highlighting potentially confusing third-party applications reach their desk with ample time left on the opposition term. And because requirements associated with understanding their needs and strategy in this growing market. In other words, are they interested only in marks that are published in Latin characters, or are they also interested in marks that are published in Chinese characters? And I believe this is something you will get into in detail with Andrew shortly. At Principium Strategies, we've invested significantly in a large team of native Chinese-speaking analysts, and they're situated in mainland China, in Europe, and in the US. We've designed software that is flexible in nature and allows us to dynamically process non-Latin character data. And we have the ability to scale up regardless of the unpredictable and seemingly overwhelming volume growth. So we've seen a doubling in data, and we were able to process this data without a hitch and a delay on delivery timeframes. For the purpose of this podcast, I think we're going to focus on the linguistic challenges associated with Chinese character watching. Principium Strategies has native speaker Chinese analysts, but we also have Andrew Woode, who's our senior analyst and I believe fluent in 17 languages, who helps us oversee this process.
Thank you, David. It sounds like from an operational perspective, this particular topic must have been keeping you extremely busy over the past few months and years. And it's really good to understand what the drivers are in China and the reasons why we're seeing all of these changes. So I'd like to turn to Andrew, and we're going to try and take a deeper dive into the aspects of the Chinese language so that we can start to build an appreciation of what the sensitivities are for trademark owners. So Andrew, let's start at the beginning, as it were. What type of language is Chinese?
Well, it's very different from many of the languages that people may be familiar with, particularly from an English perspective. It's been written for 3,000 years. It's the vehicle of a rich culture. And there is a lot of diversity in time between early literary Chinese and modern forms of the language. And there's also a lot of regional diversity. We have dialects such as Cantonese and Shanghainese, which pronounce the same original words in very different ways. For instance, the name of Hong Kong, literally fragrant harbour, and the cooking style dim sum were both borrowed into English from Cantonese in the south. And in Mandarin, the standard language, they'd be Shangang and Jianxin, respectively. However, a lot of this diversity is hidden by the use of the characters, which don't indicate pronunciation directly, and they can therefore be associated with different dialect forms, and have even historically been exported to write other languages. Japanese is an obvious one, but also historically Korean and Vietnamese. It's very different from familiar Western languages. This is true of the grammar and the vocabulary, which has very, very few words in common with English, while some of its Asian neighbours borrow a lot more. The sound patterns are particularly notable. All forms of Chinese have only a limited number of possible syllables, but like many languages of the region, it distinguishes syllables by tone. So, for instance, ma means mother, as you might expect, but with other tones, it can turn into the words for hemp, horse, scold, or be like a question mark.
Gosh, that's really interesting. So just with simple changes in the way that something's pronounced, it can actually convey really, really vastly different meaning. Maybe we could explore this a little bit further. Maybe take us through the differences in the written script. What are characters? How can we build an appreciation for what they might be?
Okay, now historically, though it's less true now in modern Mandarin, each syllable of Chinese was a distinct word. And the writing system developed from drawing pictures, the simplest concepts, such as you would take mu for tree, which looks like a tree, put two of them together, you get lin, meaning wood, and then put three of them together and get sen, meaning forest. Or alternatively, you take the word ma, meaning horse. It doesn't look like a horse much anymore, but it used to. And then you combine that with a different character to produce something which you can't actually draw easily. So the word for mother, ma, was formed by taking this horse character to show the sound and then adding the character nu for woman to give a clue to the meaning. Nowadays, many more characters have come to sound identical. So in modern Mandarin, you have to express a lot of concepts by groups of characters, such as lao hu for tiger, which was originally old tiger. And lots of concepts have always needed character groups. So the modern term jianhua for telephone, literally electric speech, or huoshan, volcano, literally fire mountain. And on average, a text of about 1,000 English words will turn into about 1,500 characters in Chinese, which is why you can say more on Twitter if you write in Chinese. Chinese school children need to acquire about 4,000 characters, though there are plenty more if you want to acquire more as an adult. I think 50,000 is about the biggest dictionaries. If you compare those 4,000 characters, the 26 letters of English or the 32 letters of Russian, understandably it takes a huge amount of school time to acquire them.
Wow, that's really interesting. The Chinese school child dealing with learning how to write and understand all of those characters compared to our much more simple alphabet. Thank you, Andrew. Sometimes when we see Chinese brands or Chinese shops or shop fronts, we see some the alphabet that we're familiar with as well. And I know that this convention is called Pinyin. I wonder if you could explain to us what that is and why it's relevant.
Okay, now obviously ever since foreigners with their own scripts encountered Chinese, people have needed to write the language phonetically in their own alphabets, and there have been many versions of this. Now Pinyin was actually developed in the 1950s by linguists in China, including a guy called Zhou Youguang, who died in 2017, aged 111. Now this is the official way of writing Chinese phonetically in the Roman alphabet. It's used for some internal purposes in China, like entering text on keyboards or using the index for a dictionary. And it also allows you to write Chinese words and names in foreign texts. But it does have its own pronunciation rules. It's not just a way of writing it for the English reader. And these can be sometimes be surprising. For instance, the Chinese art of arranging architecture harmoniously, you might think it was supposed to be read as feng shui if you saw it as an English reader, but it's actually feng shui. And the word for dragon it's L-O-N-G, so you might think it was long, but it's actually pronounced lung. And of course, some people have had trouble with the name of the current Chinese president, Mr. Xi, which of course is X-I in the spelling. And don't try to say Xi or X-I as some Westerners have made it.
It's Mr. Xi. Understood. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Continuing on this theme, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the concept of transliteration and what it means in this context.
Okay, now transliteration obviously comes in two varieties in both directions. So Chinese to English transliteration is the simple one. That almost invariably involves the Pinyin system these days. This is purely phonetic, so it loses a lot of detail from the Chinese original because, of course, often characters are pronounced the same but are distinct in shape and meaning. So as well as the tones, which are normally not written, though they can be, it fails to distinguish words which are pronounced identically. So there are two words, xing xing, star and ape, but you can't tell them apart when you put them in Pinyin, though the characters are clear. So transliteration into Chinese from English, for instance, in personal names or brands, is much more complicated. And the problem here is that Chinese syllables are very restricted, so the pronunciation will be different and not always predictable. And whatever characters you choose to use to represent the English sounds will theoretically have a meaning. So people like to tweak the character choice for a better effect. Now, where the sequence of the characters doesn't give you any obvious meaning, Chinese people will work out that it's meant to be a transliteration. They won't fuss too much about trying to read meaning into it. But sometimes the sequence can be read as making sense in Chinese, which can be good for trademarks. Sometimes they have an easy job. For instance, Armani goes into Chinese very neatly as Armani, but mostly it's a lot harder. For instance, if you wanted to transliterate the name Trump, it's either Te Lang Pu or Chuan Pu, using characters just for the sound. And the second version already caused clashes with a Chinese company called Chuan Pu, just slightly different, which has tried to use some Trump-based trademarks. And so for trademarks, many companies try to find a version which is still similar to the sound of their Western brand, but also implies some positive meanings by the characters used. The most famous case is Coca-Cola. Now, when it first got to China, there were amateur translations by shopkeepers. And the most notorious is one which is Coca-Cola, usually remembered as bite the wax tadpole, which obviously didn't really incite you to go and drink the product. So Coca-Cola thought of a brilliant official translation, which is Coca-Cola, using words for tasty and funny. And this actually wasn't the closest phonetic option, but it was a really good compromise. Similarly, IKEA uses Yijia, which is about as close phonetically as you can get to IKEA, which admittedly isn't very close, but the character meanings are suitable and home. So obviously it's a brilliant brand, even if you had no idea that it was meant to represent some foreign words.
So thanks, Andrew. So just so that we're clear, when you're thinking about coming up with a way to translate your trademark into something that's appropriate for the Chinese language, many Western companies will choose characters that, when said aloud, sound a bit like what their brand is, but there can also be sort of a secondary meaning, and that when they're doing that, they should ensure that it's a positive secondary meaning, like tasty or funny, for Coca-Cola, rather than bite the wax tadpole. Have I understood that correctly?
That's right, yes.
It's interesting. It makes the choice of characters all the more important. So plenty for businesses consider when launching in China, and we've talked about transliterations. Now, if we could turn our attention to translations. Andrew, could you maybe take us through what that means for the Chinese language and trademarks?
Yes. Now, in many cases, a foreign name or trademark has an obvious meaning, which can be translated easily into Chinese. And this can often be a good solution, especially if the sound of the foreign trademark isn't so useful. And of course, this means that the sound is then going to be completely different. So, for instance, for Apple, with its obviously Apple image as a brand, that has gone into Chinese as Pinyin, which is just the word for apple. And for the Volkswagen Beetle, again, they've been able to go down the literal translation route. So you get Jia Ke Chung, which is literally beetle, well, shell insect, I suppose, bit by bit. And of course, you can combine elements of different methods. For instance, for Starbucks, that is rendered as Xing Ba Ke, which combines a translation of the word star, Xing, plus two characters which are just used phonetically to sound like buck. And that has even been further translated into local languages on the same sort of principle.
That's fascinating. So the two concepts that you've talked through, translations and transliterations, can both be used when branding in China. Tell us a little bit more about a concept called local equivalence and what that means in the regional market.
Yes, in some cases, the brand owners have decided that there's no real point to keep a very close link to the foreign brand. And they've gone for something which makes sense in the Chinese market on its own terms. Sometimes this has a historical background. For instance, Citibank is known as Huaqi, which is literally flower flag, because their branches in China flew the American flag with its stars, which I think were seen as flowers. And so I think this is a locally derived name which sort of became official. And another example is BMW. Now, it's rather hard to translate that into Chinese on pronunciation, and nobody outside Germany knows what the letters actually stand for. So the Chinese trademark is Baoma, which means precious horse. And this picked up a Chinese tradition about horses which could travel 1,000 miles in a day. And similarly, Tesco uses Lergo, which is happy purchase, and again doesn't have a huge amount to do with the original sound.
Right. So that sounds like it's neither a translation or a transliteration, not using Pinyin, but actually finding a completely different brand identity because of how the local consumers recognize it. Would that be a good summary, Andrew?
That's right. Yes, people are branding differently in China, so there's still the link to the foreign brand, but there's not a simple relationship.
Right, that's interesting to understand. Andrew, sometimes we take instructions from customers, or we talk to them and advise them on character watching. Could you take us through what that is and how useful that type of watch is?
Well, obviously, you'll have gathered by now the relationship between Chinese characters and Western brand names is anything other than obvious. So many people will need a Chinese version of their brand. If not, people may well invent one anyway in informal use, and someone could very well register it. So whether it's your own preferred branding or whether it's something which is out there, you need to be very sure that you've got the right protection. There was one example with Pfizer, who had problems in China because a colloquial for Viagra had developed. Weiger meaning great older brother or big guy. And by the time they got around to register a trademark, they discovered this version was already owned by a local pharmaceutical company, and they had to settle for something else. So it is very important that people are aware of their branding decisions in China, and whatever they choose to go for, that they get protection for that version in characters. So in order to protect your Chinese language brand against potential character infringements, you may need to watch specifically in Chinese characters. We cover the Chinese language jurisdictions, the People's Republic of China, of course, also Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore. We find good character matches in these gazettes and then have the results reviewed by our skilled native speaker analysts.
Thank you, Andrew. Just from my side for listeners, a couple of items to conclude really. With the increase in volume that David talked about at the top of the pod, many more of their trademark watching results could be originating from the Chinese publication. So the results that they receive could be sent as a result of any one of the characteristics that we discussed today. And if anyone has any questions, they should come into us. We have the expertise. Also, if they have reflected on the kind of coverage that they have in China and want to talk specifically about local equivalents or adding a character watch to their subscription, to their portfolio, please do come in and ask us. We'll be very happy to talk about that. I want a special thank you to our experts today, to David Grossman and Andrew Woode, for sharing all of their expertise on this really important topic today. David, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Catherine. It was a pleasure.
Andrew, really appreciated hearing from you today. Thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening today.
Principium Pod is brought to you by Principium Strategies. Principium has been at the forefront of intellectual property protection for more than a century. Covering more than 180 available jurisdictions worldwide, our International Trademark Watch pairs state-of-the-art, proprietary customized software with our network of trademark analysts, who then review the results to ensure that you receive only those which will be relevant to your protected brands. Not only does Principium focus on Trademark Watch, but we also have an entire division focused on domain management, maintenance, and online brand protection. Using Principium for your domain and online brand management can save your organization expense in domain registration and management costs while providing unmatched service, protection, and security. We apply our legal, business, and technological expertise to relentlessly protect your brand. To know more, visit principiumstrategies.com. Principium Strategies, the evolution of brand security.